G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with episode 12 of Australia's Day of National Shame, Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. The Defenceless Town. 2 weeks before the raid, Wing Commander Jeffries, who had commanded an RAAF station in the Middle East, passed through Darwin and was so appalled by what he saw there that he immediately sought an interview with the Director of Air Intelligence, Wing Commander Gerald Packer. He told Packer that the state of readiness to meet an enemy attack at Darwin was, quote, ridiculous, and that the aerodrome and everything on it were indefensible and would be wiped out. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that Darwin at the time of the raid was the antithesis of everything that a wartime aerodrome ought to be. It had been laid out according to the plans that were already 5 years out of date when Japan came into the war, and it had been built on the very dangerous assumption that Darwin would never suffer anything worse than hit-and-run raids by carrier-based aircraft. Opinions about the requirements of frontline Australian air bases among the most top-ranking officers had changed little since they had been told in 1936 by British Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Edward Ellington that the likelihood of an attack on any Australian city was, quote, so remote that it could be almost disregarded, unquote. Current practice in other countries was that the main elements of a properly organised aerodrome were fighter defence, anti-aircraft defence with high reliance on Bofors guns to tackle low-flying aircraft, and functional dispersal, unquote, of aircraft personnel and stores. Effective camouflage and an adequate warning system were the other essentials. Darwin failed in every one of these categories, and most glaringly in the failure to have any kind of fighter defence. Defence experts had agreed since 1939 that a minimum of 2 squadrons of fighters, 50 planes, were necessary to give the town and the airbase any kind of meaningful protection, and that 3 and probably 4 squadrons were desirable. On February the 12th, a week before the raid, there were 2 operational fighters in Darwin, both American P-40 Kitty Hawks, which were only there because they had broken down and been left behind by the rest of their squadron. On the 15th of February, one failed to return from a routine test flight over the Timor Sea, leaving just 1 aeroplane to withstand the might of whatever air attack the Japanese might launch on Darwin. As it happened, there were more P-40s on the day of the raid, but it was quite coincidental, and they contributed almost nothing beyond boosting the tally of destruction that the Japanese could later boast about. The stock answer of the Air Department was that there were no aircraft available anywhere in Australia which could be spared for Darwin. What was not known at the time was that both Canada and America had offered fighters to Australia early in 1941, and that their offers had been turned down. Even though there was nothing else available, the air staff preferred to leave Australia without any defence fighters at all unless they could have exactly what they wanted, which was a machine like the Beaufighter. They rejected the Hurricanes from Canada because they did not have sufficient range, and the Lightnings from the United States for the rather vague reason, as the Deputy Chief of Staff, Air Vice Marshal William Bostock, put it, that, quote, they were not a good proposition, unquote. More specifically, the board was concerned that the Lightning was aerodynamically unsatisfactory. Quote, it had tricks, unquote, said Bostock, quote, and was dangerous to fly, unquote. Those who flew it said that, on the contrary, it was an excellent aircraft if it was flown with care, but it was an American plane, and the prejudice against buying American aircraft in preference to British was very strong. Bostock was later asked why he had dismissed the idea of using belly tanks, long-range fuel tanks added to the aircraft, which would have given the Hurricanes the range the Air Board wanted. He dismissed the idea, claiming that belly tanks, quote, are not a good proposition, unquote. But he failed to understand why, if this was the case, they were being used widely and successfully by Hurricanes in the Western Desert, as well as by the Germans in Crete and the Japanese Zeros which raided Darwin. The extra tanks gave the Zeros a range of 2,400 kilometres, phenomenal for a fighter and meant that they could conduct missions over Australia from a land base, Celebes or Timor. The Army was responsible for the operation of all the anti-aircraft guns in Darwin, including those protecting the aerodrome. Their location had been selected by the brigadier who had commanded the coastal defences in Sydney, and there was general agreement that they were in the wrong places, as well as being far too few in number. There were no Bofors guns available in Darwin. The Bofors was a small calibre anti-aircraft gun, 40mm I think one of my subs pointed out to me, not 20 as I said in the previous movie. Small calibre anti-aircraft gun that was larger than the conventional machine gun, and the general positioning of the guns was in striking contrast to current thinking by anti-aircraft specialists in other countries. In particular, the scattering of individual gun crews at wide distances apart in the area of the airfield markedly reduced their efficiency. In Malaya, it had been found necessary to have between 8 and 12 Bofors guns for effective aerodrome protection, and below this level their efficiency fell away sharply. At Darwin there were none, and the machine guns which were available were poor substitutes. Only luck and a target at almost point-blank range, which at least on one occasion they had during the Darwin raid, would give a machine gunner any chance of bringing down an enemy aircraft. Give you a bit of a closer view of that. Major General Blake had asked for Bofors guns, but his request had been turned down, meeting much the same response as the RAAF station had received when it had asked for its quota of rifles to be increased so that each man could at least have a personal weapon. The reply was that once quotas had been fixed, it took time to alter them, whether or not a Japanese invasion was expected the following week. As neither adequate guns nor fighters was available in Darwin, it was all the more important to implement the other measures for protecting the airbase, but even these were largely ignored. Effective aerodrome protection in most countries relied heavily on functional dispersal, or ensuring that neither people, aircraft nor equipment were kept too close together. Unfortunately, most aerodromes which existed at the outbreak of war had been designed in exactly the opposite way, and Darwin was an almost copybook example of an aerodrome built, as Air Vice Marshal Bostock put it, quote, more for efficiency of administration than security at the expense of efficiency, unquote. The need to update RAAF Darwin, which should have been a high priority since the earliest days of the war, had become critical since the Japanese occupied Ambon and their land-based bombers came within flying distance of Australia. The intensity of the attack they could launch on Darwin was now much more severe than when they had to rely on carrier-based aircraft with their smaller payload of bombs. One of the most deplorable features of the raid on Darwin was that so many aircraft were caught on the ground. Before he left for Java, Air Commodore Wilson had given his deputy, Group Captain Scherger, no instructions about getting these aircraft off the ground in the event of an attack. And the station commander, Wing Commander Griffith, had also done nothing. When he had been the station commander, Scherger had been particularly careful to ensure that there was never more than one aircraft outside the hangars at a time. He strictly policed this rule, and if he ever saw two aircraft there together, he insisted on one being removed so that in the event of a raid, aircraft losses would be kept to a minimum. Griffith, on the other hand, who succeeded him, had other ideas. His junior officers, on their own initiative, tried to disperse their aircraft to various positions away from the runway, but Griffith overruled them and just before the raid had ordered them to bring them back and concentrate them in one position. Only 3 went to a camouflage dispersion point. The officers advised him strongly to alter his decision, but he refused, saying that they would be more use if they were together close at hand. In the raid, all his aircraft, except those which were concealed, were destroyed. Documents show that an RAAF intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant Wisher, also drew Griffith's attention to his repeated failure to disperse the aircraft properly and warned him that he faced a grave risk of losing them all if he persisted in this way. Just how effectively proper disbursement could allow even a heavily blitzed airfield to continue operating was shown repeatedly overseas. In Britain, for example, during the late summer and autumn of 1940, Aerodromes were never out of action for more than 24 hours, although some of them were raided more than 1,000 times. Not in 24 hours they weren't. And closer to home, the aerodrome at Sambawang in Singapore continued to operate for 2 months against continuous Japanese attack. One senior officer described Sambawang, quote, as the most bombed area in the world, unquote, with more than 600 bombs falling on the headquarters and hangar area and with never more than 3 metres of level ground remaining between the edges of the bomb craters. In spite of this ferocious bombardment, there were only 20 casualties, most of them minor injuries among a roll call of 1,200, and because of proper disbursement, 80 aircraft operating continuously in and out of the airfield, and only 7 were destroyed on the ground throughout the entire bombardment. Not like what happened in Darwin, eh? Sambawang continued to operate simply because the aircraft were properly dispersed and men and supplies were widely scattered round the airfield, with men who knew exactly what their role was in any emergency. It provided a memorable example of what could have happened at Darwin in other circumstances. It was argued that every other airfield in Australia was as ill-equipped to cope with an attack as Darwin, and this was true. But there was no airfield on Australian soil except Darwin, which was also inside the war zone and within easy striking distance of land-based level bombers. How wrong their priorities were in Melbourne and Canberra was revealed in a memorandum from the Department of the Army signed by the permanent head after the first raid on Darwin, which attempted to answer complaints that Darwin had been left virtually undefended and that the Japanese could walk into Australia almost at will. It read in part, quote, Darwin is of course an important operational area, but it is not a vital area in the same sense as Newcastle and Port Kembla, unquote. There was a great deal that could have been done, even in the face of this apparent indifference on the part of the Air Board and the bureaucrats. The officer responsible for the general control of aerodromes in Australia so far as protecting them against attack was concerned, Group Captain William Healy, admitted later that he had given no particular instructions to the station commander at Darwin that might have helped him as the danger of an attack grew more imminent, and none at all after Darwin came within reach of the Japanese land-based bombers. Air Intelligence arranged for Wing Commander Malley to lecture the principal air stations throughout eastern and northern Australia on measures for protecting their aerodromes that had been successfully adopted by the Chinese in their war against Japan. Intelligence Chief Wing Commander Gerald Packer reported later that not a single station commander had attempted to incorporate any of the lessons that he had been given. Yet it was well known that the failure in Malaya and Java to organise the aerodromes for an effective defence was largely the result of the Air Force's refusal to learn from the lessons of the Sino-Japanese War. Ever tried to teach anything to an officer with a mind like a steel trap? Steel traps are not good at learning. Even when the officers did try to disperse their aircraft, they were likely to run foul of someone more senior far away in Melbourne or Canberra. Air Commodore Wilson had moved all his major aircraft repair facilities to Daly Waters, 500 kilometres south, to get them away from the forward area where they were not required, and it was his plan to take as many operational aircraft as possible to safer airfields. As soon as the Japanese aircraft carrier was reported in the Flores Sea on the 27th of January, he ordered the Wirraways to be sent from Darwin to Daly Waters to prevent them being caught in a surprise attack. Although the Air Board had told him that the Wirraways were now to be considered as dive bombers, nobody who actually flew them had any illusions that they were anything else but trainers. They were hardly in Daly Waters, however, when Air Vice Marshal Bostock signalled Wilson to take them back to Darwin and into the forward area. He claimed later that he believed they would be more useful in Darwin than in Daly Waters, but he was wrong. Every one was destroyed in the first raid. Some of the measures needed to bring Darwin Air Base up to a state of readiness to meet an attack were obviously outside the control of the Air Commodore or the station commander. In the United Kingdom, the RAF had been faced with the same problems of having all its buildings cluttered up together and had overcome it by constructing a number of new buildings that were widely dispersed. The old buildings remained as a target for the raiding Germans, but were used for nothing else. To do the same in Darwin would have required substantial capital expenditure, and they had as much chance of securing that as of getting a loan from the Mint. The business board which approved such matters had only given Darwin authority to camouflage anything after Japan had been in the war for a fortnight. The work had progressed so slowly that little had been done to camouflage the station by the time the Japanese attacked, and it presented an almost perfect target for the pilots. One ammunition dump was actually still painted white in accordance with Air Force standing instructions, and no authority had been received to alter it. There were many similar situations, however, where a great deal could have been done quickly to improve the situation with a little more initiative on the part of the station commander. It would have taken little or no money, for instance, to have camouflaged the roofs of buildings with a mixture of oil and sand, and that would have given them a degree of protection against the high-level bombers. But whatever defensive measures a station such as Darwin adopted, and however efficiently the station was run, they would have been almost entirely negated if there was no way of knowing that the Japanese were coming in the first place. Even though the disastrous consequences of the raid on the 19th were largely the result of a warning being ignored, Darwin had never had an adequate warning system, and again this was almost exclusively the fault of the Air Board and the government. While other nations involved in the war had three distinct methods of warning of an impending attack, Darwin was denied all of them. These methods included radar, or radio location as it was still known, an air observer system, and wireless intelligence units with interception and direction finding equipment for pinpointing enemy aircraft and signals. Radar was still being installed at the time of the raid. An observer system had been consistently rejected until the beginning of that year, and even 3 months after the raid on Darwin, wireless intelligence units had not been approved, although intelligence officers who knew their worth from overseas experience had been pleading for them since 1940. Darwin did not even have a reconnaissance aircraft with sufficient range to tell them what was happening on the other side of Timor. As events showed, an enemy fleet could form up and launch an attack there without anyone in Darwin being the wiser. On occasions it was found that American intelligence sources had information about enemy activity in the South Pacific that directly threatened Darwin's safety, but they made no effort to pass it on. The only means the RAAF had for detecting the approach of enemy aircraft was a 24-hour lookout standing on a tower on the RAAF base, together with reports from the Coast Watching Service operated by the Navy. The Coast Watchers, like the Sacred Heart mission on Bathurst Island, varied enormously in their efficiency and the amount of detail they passed back to Darwin. Invaluable as many of them were, they were hardly ideal as the Air Force's sole means of knowing if it was about to be attacked. As events on the 19th showed, the apparently simple problem of resolving a plane's identity was enough to threaten the whole system. There was no operational radar at Darwin, although it was available by then. Ironically, the first operational radar set for detecting aircraft was actually in the process of being installed on the day of the raid. It was being erected on a cliff at Dripstone Caves, a few kilometres north of the town, facing out across the Timor Sea. It was intended to have an operating range of 160 kilometres. After the raid, it was hurriedly completed, and after a few teething problems, greatly improved the warning time of approaching aircraft. But on the 19th, it still had no antenna. Intelligence Director Packer wanted the RAAF to have its own observer network so that it would not have to rely on the Navy's coast watchers, but the dead hand of Bostock was always there denying him permission. It was only well after the Japanese had entered the war that Packer finally had his way by going over Bostock's head. Bostock also refused permission for wireless intelligence units to be set up, although they were being increasingly and effectively used by almost all other belligerents. Without them, there was no way of efficiently intercepting enemy communications or of finding the source of his signals. One of the special difficulties facing Australian intelligence services, which Packer in particular wanted to overcome with his wireless intelligence units, was that the Japanese did not use international Morse code but had a system of their own. It required at least 3 months to train the average Australian to understand this Japanese code. Yet until this was done, there was no way the Air Force intelligence could intercept a message from a Japanese aircraft and understand what it meant. Few things gave greater impetus to Packer in his attempts to secure a wireless intelligence unit than the certainty that fifth columnists were operating unmolested inland. Little thought had been given by most people in Darwin to the possibility that there were spies at work among them, but had they looked, there was ample evidence. The signal being flashed to the Japanese aircraft on the morning of the raid, spotted by Charles Stewart from the bridge of the Zealandia, was only one of many such incidents which records show were almost invariably treated as unrelated incidents and ignored or only half-heartedly investigated. Most of the Japanese who were in the Northern Territory when war with Japan was declared were quickly rounded up and interned on the same day. Major General Blake himself signed the internment order for 69 of them, which, as he put it, quote, accounted for the whole lot of them, unquote. Among those arrested was a Japanese man who confessed to being involved in espionage and who had among his papers a detailed map of the RAAF aerodrome. He was imprisoned. But Blake was almost certainly wrong, because there had been many more than that number in the Territory, quite apart from the crews of the pearling boats, which worked mainly off the coast of Western Australia, but frequently came into Northern Territory water. It would have been very easy for these boats, or for a Japanese warship or submarine for that matter, to land an agent on a deserted stretch of coast from where he could set up a wireless post and be almost sure of remaining undetected. And there were other Japanese who had been living in Darwin who slipped through the cordon and evaded arrest. At the time of the raid, it was strongly suspected that among the Japanese who escaped in this way was an individual or a group which had set up a radio station inland on a bearing between Darwin and Daly Waters. The first inkling of this came just before the raid, when RAAF wireless operators intercepted a message in Japanese Morse coming from that bearing. 40 minutes later, the station to which the message had been sent replied in cipher and was acknowledged again in Japanese Morse. What was transmitted was never discovered because nobody at the RAAF base understood Japanese Morse, and there was no way of decoding it, of recording it. Shortly after this, there was an incident at Port Moresby in New Guinea which produced further proof of Japanese infiltration at Darwin, and at the same time showed how easily a spy could operate right under the noses of the security forces without detection. At Port Moresby, a Japanese was captured releasing meteorological balloons, and when inquiries were made at Darwin, intelligence officers found several people, including officers, who recalled seeing the same type of balloons being released near the aerodrome, including one on the day of the raid, but who had assumed that they were being released by RAAF weather forecasters. The descriptions of the balloons made it very clear that they were nothing like those used by Australian or American meteorologists, and the inescapable conclusion was that they were sent up for the benefit of the Japanese. Released at ground level, the balloons gave an indication of the direction and strength of the wind and were a valuable aid to high-level bombers which had to allow for the wind when releasing their bombs. The existence of the balloons was not discovered until almost 3 weeks later. There was a widespread belief among servicemen in Darwin that the Aborigines on Melville Island were sympathetic to the Japanese. Pilot Officer Garnet Soliu often talked with pilots returning from reconnaissance flights over Bathurst and Melville Islands and, rightly or wrongly, formed the opinion within only a short time of being in Darwin, as he later told the Royal Commission, quote, that the Melville Islanders were heart and soul with the Japanese and that they were far more likely to assist the Japanese than to assist us, unquote. Melville Island then had an Aboriginal population of about 1,000. There was little evidence to support the theory, and the missionaries who knew and lived with the Melville Islanders said it was nonsense. But it was a constant source of concern to Australian intelligence units on the grounds that it might be true, and it was seriously suggested at one stage that a special military unit should be based on Melville Island to ensure that there was no collaboration. It sometimes seemed that the officers in Darwin were more likely to judge whether a person was a spy or not by his appearance rather than his nationality. Major General Blake dismissed the idea that 5 Japanese men claiming to be shipwrecked sailors who had been picked up on Melville Island were spies on the irrefutable grounds that, quote, they were a low type of fellow and nothing in the spy class at all as far as we could see, unquote. On the other hand, there were unquestionably civilians in Darwin who were sympathetic to the Japanese. The Italians came in for a certain amount of fairly vague suspicion of being fifth columnists, as did some of the influential members of the North Australian Workers' Union. In the case of a few Italians, however, there were very grave grounds for suspicion, which sometimes led to ill will between the services because of the way in which the matter was investigated. One of these incidents involved an Italian who was discovered signalling out to sea from his home near the RAAF base. He was seen by an officer who hurried round to the house, arrested the man and hauled him back to the base, together with some of the man's possessions, which included £120 in cash, the addresses of a number of Japanese people and a map of northern Australia. He was taken before Air Commodore Wilson, who questioned him closely about his behaviour, the map, and how he came to have so much money in his possession when he earned only about £23 a fortnight. The man's explanations were not satisfactory, so Wilson followed the set procedure and handed him over to the Army. The Army did its own interrogation, but were apparently satisfied that the man posed no danger, for they released him, but without telling the Air Force. The next night, the RAAF again caught him signalling out to sea and again could get no satisfactory story to explain who he was signalling to. The Army had given him back his address book and his map, but this time Wilson immediately contacted Major General Blake and gave him his opinion about having an unnaturalised Italian on the perimeter of an Australian airbase flashing messages out to sea. This time the would-be fifth columnist, if that's what he was moved out of Darwin. One of the most depressing features of the disastrous raid was that it so clearly demonstrated that few, if any, of the lessons already learned in the war had been put to good use. Steel trap theory. Lessons learned in Crete, Malta and Malaya, as well as German experience in similar situations, were all available to RAAF officers at Darwin, although, for all the good they did, they might never have been sent to them. One particular memorandum, number 3 of 20 August 1941, issued by the Directorate of Air Intelligence, contained enough information on situations almost identical to those encountered at Darwin during the raid to have prevented at least some of the damage that was caused. As a simple example, camouflaged insets had been used early in the war in Malaya to conceal aircraft from Japanese raiders. They were placed just outside the aerodrome perimeter. When the Japanese realised what was happening, however, they began routinely strafing and bombing the area outside the perimeter up to a distance of 100 metres, and in Malaya they destroyed numerous aircraft hidden in this way in a few raids. After that, the Japanese almost always attacked this area outside the perimeter until the Allies naturally stopped putting their aeroplanes there. In Darwin, though, nobody apparently had read this, although it was clearly described in intelligence reports that were given wide circulation among all the officers. They put several of their aircraft just outside the perimeter. The Japanese predictably came down and strafed the area and aeroplanes were destroyed. The Air Board, as an angry Gerald Packer told the Royal Commission, was fully advised of every defect at Darwin Aerodrome. It knew there was no camouflage, that all the facilities were concentrated in one small area, that the fighter and gun defences were inadequate or non-existent, and that there was no warning system that could be relied on. It knew, yet in spite of repeated prodding and coaxing, it did nothing for 18 months. In particular, there was not a single one of these defects and shortcomings that had not been brought personally to the notice of the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, Air Vice Marshal William Bostock, who was accused of being indifferent to the fate of Darwin and a bottleneck for almost every proposal put forward for improving Darwin's chances of surviving an attack. But the Air Board also had its own way of dealing with officers, however competent, who threatened to rock their secure boat. Wing Commander Gerald Packer, Director of Air Intelligence, spoke out against his ineffectual seniors, and particularly against Bostock once too often. He was suddenly relieved of his job and posted as Air Attaché to Chongqing, a town in the remote interior of China, some 1,500 kilometres due west of Shanghai. It was an ingenious way of ensuring that he would cause no more trouble, because Chongqing was impossible to reach. Packer therefore became Supernumerary Director of Intelligence on permanent leave, with no access to officers who might take notice of his anger, and bound by oaths of silence that prevented him from even mentioning the matter in public. Here endeth Chapter 12. There's a lot to YouTube. More to come. Ciao.